The feed was already live when Arbiter Thissavain noticed the humans' hands, not their words, not their posture, their hands. Every other delegate from every other species in the Conclave's 300-year history had placed their hands flat on the testimony table, palms down, fingers still, the universal posture of submission to the proceeding. It was instinct. It was biology. When a smaller creature faces institutional power, the body remembers what the mind forgets, and it goes still. The human's hands were moving, not frantically, not nervously. Slowly, methodically, the human's right thumb was pressing into the flesh of her left palm, rotating in small circles, the way you might work a knot out of tired muscle. She wasn't looking at her hands. She was looking directly at the Sophan, across 40 meters of broadcast-lit chamber, and she was smiling with her eyes in a way that didn't match any emotional register his training had prepared him for. The galaxy was watching. 4.7 billion registered viewers across 11 species, and something about those moving hands made the Sophan feel, for the first time in his career, that he had already made a mistake he couldn't identify yet. The proceeding had been his idea. The Sophan had spent 19 years building toward this moment, not out of malice exactly, but out of something more dangerous than malice, absolute certainty. He was Arbiter Prime of the Galactic Conclave Standards Tribunal, and in his estimation, humanity had been permitted to embarrass the institution long enough. They had arrived at galactic civilization late. Centuries late by any meaningful measure. They had no homeworld fleet capable of engaging a Tier 3 defense network. Their biology was fragile in ways that still made Kesseron physicians uncomfortable to document. They slept. Actually surrendered consciousness for 8 hours out of every 24, and their single most advanced diplomatic contribution to the Conclave in 11 years of provisional membership had been a nutritional supplement that, while genuinely effective, smelled strongly of fermented fruit and made 3 species mildly euphoric without consent. The Conclave's inner circle had been patient. Sophan had stopped being patient 14 months ago when humanity's provisional delegate, one Dr. Yale Oren, had submitted a 700-page counter-proposal to the Conclave's Resource Allocation Standard, a document that had taken 40 years and participation from 63 civilizations to produce, and had done so 11 minutes before the ratification vote. That was not a counter-proposal. High Counselor Merrick Voss had said privately afterward in Safeyan's office. That was a performance. It was an insult. The Safeyan replied, "Those may be the same thing with humans." "We don't know yet." "Then let's find out," the Soban said, publicly. The proceeding was broadcast under Article 7 of the Conclave's Transparency Covenant, the rarely used provision that allowed any standards tribunal to convene in full galactic view. The Sophan had framed it as a matter of institutional health, a civilizational audit, humanity's 11-year record of provisional membership, examined against the Conclave's admission standards, live, for every species to observe. The framing was careful. The intent was surgical. He intended to demonstrate, with perfect procedural courtesy and comprehensive documented evidence, that humanity was not ready, that their admission to full membership should be suspended, their provisional status reduced to observer, and their resource allocations reviewed. He would do this not with aggression, but with data. With 11 years of behavioral records, diplomatic failures, biological assessments, psychological evaluations, and the testimony of 6 Conclave-appointed experts who had studied human civilization at close range, he would do it live, in front of 4 billion viewers, so that when humanity protested, and they would protest loudly the way they always did, no one could say the process was hidden. It was, the Sophan believed, the perfect instrument. He had not accounted for Yale Oren's hands. Dr. Oren. His voice filled the chamber with the practiced resonance of 3 decades in tribunal work. You are the current provisional delegate for the human species, as registered with the Conclave Secretariat. You have been informed of the purpose of this proceeding. Do you understand the charges as presented?" She looked up from her hands. "I do," she said. Her conclave standard was flawless, better than flawless. She had no accent. She spoke at 0.94 of native conclave standard cadence, which was faster than most non-native speakers managed after decades of practice. She'd learned it in 4 years. "Do you want me to summarize them back to you, or are we trusting that I'm competent enough to retain a list?" A small ripple moved through the chamber gallery, something between shock and a sound the Sylvain couldn't classify. "That will not be necessary," he said. "Then let's begin," Yael Oren said, and smiled again with those unreadable eyes. The first expert was Dr. Pelham Rish, a Keth-Saron xenobiologist of some distinction. His testimony was comprehensive, professionally delivered, and deeply uncomfortable for the human to sit through, or so Sylvain had anticipated. Humans were physiologically inferior to the conclave mean in 17 of 23 standard metrics: lifespan, physical resilience, sensory range, neural processing speed, immune complexity, atmospheric tolerance. The data was not opinion. It was measured, verified, replicated. The species in aggregate, Pelham-Risch concluded, presents a biological profile consistent with a mid-tier developing civilization. There are no outlier adaptive traits that would suggest unusual resilience or specialization. The Sylvain waited for the reaction from the human delegate. Yael Oren had been taking notes the entire time, not on a data slate, on paper. She brought actual paper into the chamber, a hand-bound notebook with a frame cover, and she was writing with what appeared to be a pen that used liquid ink, a technology so archaic that 3 members of the press gallery had zoomed their feeds to confirm it. She did not look upset. She looked like she was at a lecture she'd attended before and was checking whether the professor had updated the material. "Dr. Oren," the Sylvain said, "you are permitted a response. Thank you." She didn't look up immediately. She finished her sentence on the paper. Then she looked up. "Can you ask Dr. Pelham-Risch what metric he used for pain tolerance?" The Sylvain glanced at the xenobiologist. Pelham-Risch straightened slightly. Pain response was measured against Conclave Standard Protocol 14. Humans rated within normal range. Normal range for what species? A pause. The Conclave mean, which excludes humans from its own calculation, since we're provisional. "So you measured our pain tolerance against a mean we're not part of, and concluded we're average." She wrote something. "Okay, go ahead." Pelham-Risch looked at the Sylvain. The Sylvain said nothing. The second expert took the stand. The second expert was Counselor Emeritus Veth Duran, a diplomatic historian. His testimony covered 11 years of humanity's provisional record, the counter-proposals filed at inconvenient times, the negotiating tactics that other species found destabilizing, the refusal to accept resource allocation minimums, the borderline provocative language in formal dispatches, the incident with the fermented supplement. "The behavioral pattern is consistent," Veth Duran said. "Humans engage with the Conclave's procedural systems not as collaborative participants, but as adversarial agents. They treat established consensus as a starting position for negotiation rather than as a settled outcome." Soveni watched Yael Oren during this. She had stopped taking notes. She was watching Veth Duran with her chin resting on her folded hands and an expression of such genuine, absorbed attention that it looked almost warm. When Veth Duran finished, she said, "Counselor Emeritus, the 11 years you reviewed, is that the full record?" "It is the full record of humanity's provisional membership, yes. Did your review include the period before provisional membership was granted?" "The pre-admission period is outside the scope of this tribunal." She unfolded her hands. "Interesting. Because the record of that period includes 22 formal requests by human representatives to participate in the drafting process for the resource allocation standard. All 22 were declined on procedural grounds. 22 requests over 9 years. I have the timestamps if the tribunal needs them." Silence. "We did not decline your counter-proposal," Veth Daran said carefully. "You declined to let us participate before there was anything to counter. Then you were surprised that we countered." She picked up her pen. "I'm not saying that to be argumentative. I'm saying it because the behavioral pattern you described has a cause that isn't in your record." Veth Darren said nothing more. The feed's viewership had climbed to 6.3 billion by the third hour. The Sovane didn't know this yet. His communications officer had stopped interrupting him with updates because the updates had become distracting. What the Sovane did know was that the proceeding was not going the way he had designed it. Not because Yale Oren was being combative. That was the part that was making him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't articulate. She wasn't combative. She wasn't defensive. She wasn't performing outrage or wounded dignity, or the elaborate formal protests that most species resorted to when their civilizational record was publicly scrutinized. She was interested. She listened to every expert with what appeared to be genuine attention, asked 2 or 3 precise questions after each testimony, wrote things in her paper notebook, and then sat back with the expression of someone who had just received new information they were genuinely processing. It was, this Sovane realized, exactly what a good faith participant in a genuine inquiry would look like. He had not planned for good faith. He had planned for a conflict he could manage. Between the 4th and 5th expert testimonies, there was a scheduled recess. The Sovane moved to the Arbiter's anteroom and his communications officer, Senafal, was waiting. "The viewership numbers," Senafal said, and stopped. "Tell me, 6.3 billion live viewers, Arbiter. The Veth Duran exchange has already generated 200 million secondary shares on the Conclave's public networks. The human delegate's final statement is the most replicated clip from any tribunal proceeding in 40 years. Senafal hesitated. "The sentiment analysis on the shares, what about it?" "The dominant sentiment is not what we projected." The Sovane waited. 71% of the sentiment signals are categorized as. Senafal checked the data once more, visibly uncomfortable. "Sympathetic to the human position, Arbiter." The room was very quiet. "We're at the midpoint of the proceeding," the Sovane said. "Yes, the full biological and psychological assessment hasn't been entered into record yet. The behavioral pattern analysis, the resource dependency documentation." "Correct." The Sovane straightened his formal collar, a habit from years ago that his body still performed when he was recalibrating. "Then we continue." The psychological evaluation was the piece the Sovane had been most competent in. He'd commissioned it specifically for this proceeding, a full-spectrum assessment of humanity's collective behavioral psychology conducted by the Conclave's most respected xenopsychology team, led by Dr. Orath Sen, whose work on civilizational maturity indices was considered foundational. The assessment had taken 3 years. Its conclusion, in brief, humans exhibited persistent irrational behavioral tendencies that were incompatible with the cooperative decision-making frameworks that underpinned Conclave membership. Specifically, loss aversion inversion, where humans frequently chose options with higher personal cost when lower cost alternatives were available. Emotional reasoning that overrode logical self-interest. A documented tendency to maintain commitments even after the rational calculus of those commitments had turned negative. And most troublingly, a pattern the assessment team had labeled adversarial altruism, behavior that benefited others at genuine, non-symbolic cost to the acting individual in contexts where no reciprocal benefit was expected or received. These patterns, Dr. Orath Sen said, are not adaptive within standard civilizational models. They represent a persistent failure to optimize, which, at scale, creates unpredictable systemic risk for any institution in which humans participate. Yale Oren had stopped writing. She was staring at Orath Sen, not with anger, with something Thesophane couldn't read at all. "Dr. Orath Sen," she said, when Thesophane granted her the response period, I want to make sure I understand your conclusion. You're saying that humans make choices that cost themselves more than necessary, honor commitments past the point of logical benefit, and help others without expecting anything back. And your assessment is that this makes us a liability. In terms of predictive modeling, yes. Rational actors are I understand rational actors. Something had changed in her voice, not louder, not sharper, but heavier. My question is different. I want to know if your assessment team, at any point in 3 years of studying us, asked a follow-up question. We were thorough. Did anyone ask, Yale Oren said, what happens to the civilizations that share a difficult situation with a species that doesn't abandon commitments, doesn't stop when the cost gets too high, and helps without calculating whether the help is worth it? The chamber was very still. Did anyone ask, she continued, what it's like to be our ally? Orat Sen said nothing. Because I have data on that, Yale Oren said. I brought it. I'd like to enter it into the record. This was the moment. The Sovan would think about it later, reviewing the recording alone in his office at a time he wouldn't admit to his staff. This was the exact moment the proceeding became something he no longer controlled. Not because Yale Oren produced a dramatic revelation, not because she delivered a speech. She reached into the bag she brought, the same bag with the paper notebook, and she produced a data slate, and she submitted it to the record clerk with the same unhurried efficiency she'd used for everything else. The data slate contained testimony from other species, from the Vorith Collective, whose outer colony of Meridian Station had been struck by a cascade atmospheric failure 17 months into human provisional membership. 3 human ships had been in the sector, not military ships, a survey vessel, a medical transport, and a private cargo hauler. They had responded without waiting for conclave authorization, without calculating whether the rescue fell within their provisional mandate, without communicating anything to the conclave at all until after the operation was complete. The atmospheric failure had killed an estimated 6,000 before the intervention. It killed 407. 2 of the 3 human ships were severely damaged. 1 human crew member died. She hadn't mentioned this until now. For 11 years, the second testimony was from the Sahari Communion. The third was from the Drell Transit Authority. The fourth, Arbiter. Senefal's voice in his private earpiece. The viewership numbers have changed again. The Sophane didn't respond. He was watching Yale Oren sit quietly while the record clerk verified and logged each document, and he was thinking about the hands, about what it meant that she'd been pressing her thumb into her palm in small circles since the proceeding began. She wasn't nervous, she was holding herself steady. There was a difference. He understood it now, too late. She was called back to the testimony position for cross-examination by the tribunal's legal assessor, who had the thin look of a person who has realized they're on the wrong side of something and is trying to find the door. Dr. Oren. The testimonies you've entered into record, were these solicited for the purpose of this proceeding? Some of them, she said, some, about 30%. The other 70% were submitted to me unsolicited when other species learned this proceeding was scheduled. A pause. They contacted you. They contacted us. Humans, not me personally. The office received more than we could process. We had to select. She looked at the assessor with that steady attention. You can subpoena the full archive if the tribunal needs to verify. That won't be. The assessor stopped. Reconsidered. Dr. Oren, your record of non-compliance with conclave resource allocation structures remains a factual matter. We didn't take what we were allocated because we didn't need all of it. Silence. Under the standard allocation framework, we were allocated the same resource tier as a species of 4 billion with a developing energy grid. We are a species of 9.7 billion with a developed energy grid that runs partially on forms of generation your assessment team classified as primitive in the biological report. She turned her pen end over end once between her fingers. Our actual consumption is lower than our allocation. We kept returning the surplus. The conclave kept reallocating it to us. We kept returning it. This happened 14 times. After the 14th time, we stopped formally returning it and simply didn't access it because the paperwork cycle was consuming more energy than the surplus was worth. The assessor looked at the Sovan. The Sovan was very still. "This is not in the resource dependency documentation," the assessor said quietly to the room. "I know," Yaloran said. "I noticed. The 6th expert, the 7th. Desovan kept the proceeding running because stopping it would have been worse. Stopping it would have been the moment the galaxy saw him flinch. He kept it running, and he listened to each testimony, and he watched Yale Oren respond to each one with the same unhurried, grounded, slightly warm precision, and he thought, "I misidentified what this species was afraid of. I thought they were afraid of losing membership, of losing status, of being diminished publicly. They weren't afraid of this proceeding. She had never been afraid of this proceeding." He understood, somewhere around the 6th testimony, why. She had known everything they were going to say. She had known every piece of evidence that would be entered. She had known the shape of the argument before she walked into the chamber. And she had spent 11 years in provisional membership, not trying to avoid this tribunal. She had been preparing for it, not to fight it, not to counter-argue it point by point, to let it happen, to let it run, to let the galaxy every piece of evidence that made humanity look limited, irrational, incomplete, and then let the galaxy ask what it meant. "I need to ask you something," Desavan said, during what should have been the final recess. She was in the corridor outside the chamber. She'd stopped to drink water from a small metal container, another archaic human artifact, and she looked at him over the rim of it without surprise. "Go ahead," she said. "Did you know, when we scheduled this proceeding, did you know what we intended?" She lowered the container. "Arbiter Prime. We've been provisional members for 11 years. In that time, I have attended 307 formal conclave sessions. I have read every piece of institutional literature produced in the last 40 years. I have spoken personally to delegates from 39 of the 63 species who drafted the resource allocation standard." A pause. "Yes, I knew." "Why didn't you?" He stopped, reframed. "What did you expect to happen today?" She looked at him for a long moment. "I expected you to make your case as well as you possibly could," she said, "because that's what this institution is for. If your case was strong enough to end our membership, then our membership should end. That's how it's supposed to work." She tucked the water container away. "If it wasn't strong enough, then the galaxy gets to watch how we handle being asked to justify ourselves, and that's worth something too." She went back into the chamber. The final testimony was Thesavan's own. He'd planned it as a summation, a closing argument, carefully written, building on everything the experts had established, leaving the tribunal with a clear case for reducing humanity's status. He had practiced it. He delivered it. It was good. It was thorough. It was everything he planned. He watched the chamber while he spoke, and he saw that the gallery observers, representatives of 14 species who had attended in person, were watching him with expressions he recognized as polite attention. They were waiting for him to finish. They'd already decided something. He could feel it. When he finished, he permitted Yale Oren her closing statement. She stood up. She didn't use the data slate. She didn't use her notes. She looked at the chamber, at the gallery, at the broadcast array, at the 6.9 billion viewers that he still didn't know about, and she spoke for 3 minutes. He would transcribe it afterward. He would read the words 100 times. But in the moment, what he remembered wasn't the words. It was the quality of silence in the chamber, the way it changed, the way it went from procedural quiet to something else, something you could almost put weight on. She said that humanity had never asked to be the strongest. She said they hadn't arrived at galactic civilization carrying promises of military might or technological transcendence. She said they'd arrived carrying something the assessment found irrational, and the behavioral analysis found unpredictable, and the biological survey found unimpressive. We arrived carrying the particular stubbornness, she said, of a species that has buried more of its own people than any of you have ever counted, and kept going. We don't keep going because we're optimized for it. We keep going because the alternative is to stop. And we have never, in our entire history, been able to figure out how to do that. She paused. You wanted to show the galaxy who we are. I think you did. She sat down. The tribunal deliberated for 6 hours. The Sovan sat alone in the arbiter's chamber during the deliberation, with the broadcast feed open on a secondary screen that he wasn't officially supposed to be monitoring. He watched the public commentary network cycle through the Orin testimony clips. He watched Aborth Collecta's official public communication platform, which had not posted anything about human relations in 4 years, release a statement that was 7 words long. We remember what they did for us. He watched the Sahari Communion do the same. Then the drill, then 8 species he hadn't spoken to, whose testimonies weren't even in Orin's submitted record, who had simply decided that now was the time. He watched the numbers. 9.1 billion viewers, a conclave broadcast record. The previous record had been set 11 years ago, during humanity's provisional admission vote, which had passed by a margin of 1. He thought about 22 formal requests, declined on procedural grounds over 9 years. He thought about a species that returned surplus resources 14 times before giving up on the paperwork. He thought about 3 ships, a survey vessel, a medical transport, a cargo hauler, that hadn't calculated whether a rescue was within their mandate before performing it. He thought about the hands, the thumb working circles into the palm, not fear. Steadiness, a body reminding itself to stay present. What kind of species, he thought, prepares for years for a proceeding designed to humiliate them, and prepares not to fight it, but to survive it cleanly? What kind of species comes to their own trial carrying testimonials they never mentioned? He understood, finally, what the misinterpretation had been. Not one mistake, but a layered architecture of them, each one logical, each one building on the last, each one wrong in the same direction. He had assumed that what humans feared was the outcome. He had built the entire proceeding around the leverage of a negative verdict. They didn't fear the verdict. They feared something else. Something his species didn't have a clean word for. The thing that lives in the gap between choosing to keep going and knowing the cost of it. The thing that makes a hand press circles into a palm to hold the body still. The tribunal voted. Humanity's provisional status was not revoked. The motion to reduce their standing to observer failed 11-2. 3 tribunal members filed supplementary statements that Sophane had not seen before the vote, procedurally unusual, almost unprecedented, asking the conclave's full council to review whether humanity's provisional membership should be converted to full membership ahead of the standard evaluation schedule. The Sophane signed the verdict document in his official capacity. The pen moved across it. He filed it with the record clerk. He did not feel victorious. He did not feel defeated. He felt for the first time in 19 years of tribunal work that he had been in the presence of something he had not adequately prepared to measure. Later, 2 weeks later, he requested a private meeting. Not official, not on record. She agreed. They met in a small room in the conclave's administrative wing. She brought the paper notebook. She didn't open it. I want to understand something, he said. All right, the Voreth Rescue, Meridian Station. You never entered that into any official record. 11 years. You never used it. No. Why? She was quiet for a moment, not thinking of an answer. He recognized the difference now, the texture of genuine reflection versus the pause that precedes a prepared response. Because we didn't do it to be used, she said. He looked at his hands on the table. the crew member who died. Her name was Constance Adeyemi. She was the cargo hauler's engineer. She went back into a sealed compartment to reroute power to the medical bay. She knew the compartment was compromised. A pause that had weight in it. She had 2 children. The room was very quiet. Did she know, he started, that it was compromised? Yes. Yale Oren picked up her pen, looked at it, put it down. She went anyway. Why? The question was honest. That was the thing. After 19 years of tribunal proceedings where every question was tactical, this one was just honest. He needed to know. She looked at him across the small table in the administrative wing. This woman who had spent 4 years learning a language perfectly, who had attended 307 sessions and read 40 years of institutional literature and never once led with the thing that would have made her case simplest. Because there were children on the station, she said, not just hers, others. He said nothing. That's not a calculation, she said. I know it doesn't work as a calculation. It's not supposed to. He thought about Orat Sen's 3-year assessment. The category adversarial altruism. The conclusion, unpredictable systemic risk. He thought about how a civilization of 9.7 billion people who had buried more of their dead than any galactic species had ever counted had metabolized that kind of loss into something that sent a woman back into a sealed compartment for other people's children. He thought about what it would mean for the galaxy if that impulse, irrational, unmeasurable, catastrophically inefficient, turned out to be the most important thing any civilization could carry. I owe you an apology, he said. She shook her head. You made a case you believed in. The process worked. I tried to use the process to produce a predetermined outcome. I know, she didn't say it harshly. So did I. He looked at her. I came prepared to let the truth be visible, she said. That's also using the process. Everyone who walks into a tribunal is trying to produce an outcome. A small pause. The difference was what we were each willing to show. He left the meeting carrying a feeling he couldn't classify. Not shame, not respect, though it borrowed from both. Something more like the sensation of having measured a distance incorrectly and then discovering that the error was fundamental, that it went all the way back to the tool you used to measure. He had spent 19 years measuring civilizations. He had built the measurement instruments himself. He understood now that his instruments had a consistent blind spot. They measured what species were willing to do when the cost was acceptable. They couldn't measure what happens after the cost exceeds everything rational. When the math says stop, when every model predicts failure, when the compromise is right there and comfortable and perfectly defensible and a species refuses. Not because they have calculated a better path, not because they have more to offer, because they don't know how to stop. The full membership vote came 14 months later. It passed. The margin was not 1. The margin was 51-0 with 4 abstentions. The Sophane was not one of the abstentions. He watched the broadcast in the same administrative wing where he'd met Oren, alone, with the screen low. He watched her receive the certification in the main chamber, watched her accept it with that same steadiness, that same quality of presence that had unsettled him from the moment he saw her hands moving. She didn't look relieved. That was what stayed with him. The vote came down, and the chamber acknowledged it, and Yale Oren, full delegate now, first in human history, stood in the broadcast light of 9.4 billion viewers, a new record, not for spectacle this time, but for something else, something the viewership analytics couldn't name. And she didn't look like someone who had just won. She looked like someone who understood the weight of what came next. He thought about Constance Adeyemi. 2 children, a sealed compartment, a choice that couldn't be calculated. He thought about a species that had been practicing for their entire existence the specific skill of continuing forward after every rational argument for stopping had already been made. A species that had turned that refusal into something indistinguishable from hope. The galaxy had wanted to see humanity diminished on that broadcast. 11 months ago, It had seen them clearly instead. And clarity, it turned out, was more dangerous than any argument the Sylvain could have prepared. Not dangerous, the way a weapon is dangerous. Dangerous, the way a truth is dangerous, once it has been seen by 9 billion people at the same time and cannot be unseen. Humanity was not the oldest civilization in the galaxy, not the strongest, not the most advanced, not the most rational, not the most powerful. They were, it turned out, the species the galaxy had been looking for without knowing what it was looking for, the species that sat down in the chamber of its own trial with a paper notebook and a water bottle and 22 rejected requests in its file and testimonials it had never weaponized, and waited with moving hands and steady eyes to be seen accurately. And the galaxy, seeing them. All 9 billion viewers across 11 species, watching a small woman in a broadcast-lit chamber refuse to be either diminished or defensive, felt something shift. Not fear, exactly. Not comfort either. Something more like the feeling of realizing you have been standing next to something significant for a long time without recognizing it, and now you have recognized it, and you cannot go back to the moment before you did, and you are not entirely sure whether what you feel is relief or the beginning of awe. The Sylvain turned off the screen. He sat for a while in the quiet room. Then he picked up a pen, a real one. One that used liquid ink that he had ordered quietly 3 weeks ago without telling anyone, and he opened the file on his desk and he began to write.